Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chaim Yacobi. I'm the program leader of the Health in Urban Development Master Program at the DPU, and I'm very, very happy to co-host with Hannah Zender, that you'll meet soon, the first Dialogues in Development today, Healing and Rebuilding Beirut, Lessons from a City Demanding Political and Social Change. Few things about the webinar. First of all, we're very happy to have an Arabic interpretation, which is available. All you have to do is to click interpretation and then Arabic. We have also a Q&A box where you're very welcome to pose all your questions. And at the end of the panel, I hope that we will have enough time to have a short discussion with the panelists. And if you have any relevant information that you would like to share, please use the chat. I would also like to mention that this webinar event is recorded. So as I've mentioned before, I'm co-hosting this Dialogue in Development event with Hannah Zender, who is a PhD at the DPU. And we are very happy to have an excellent panel today that will include Maya Atouni, who is a clinical psychologist and the co-founder and president of Embrace. Professor Sari Hanafi from American University of Beirut, and is also the president of the International Sociological Association. Abir Saksuk, who is an architect, urbanist, and co-founder of Public Works Studio. And finally, Professor Nasser Yassin, professor of policy and planning at the Health and Management and Policy Department at the American University of Beirut. So welcome everyone. Hannah.
Thanks, Chaim. So thank you everyone for coming today. This is the first webinar, I think, in a series that DPU is hosting on COVID-19 responses and recovery. And Beirut is a really fascinating case because we're exploring a place here where COVID-19 is one of the many interrelating crises. And it's actually quite difficult to know how to introduce Beirut and to talk about or describe what people in Lebanon are facing today. And so I think, as many people have done in the past few months, I'm turning to art to give me a place to start from. And I'm going to read two sections from a poem by someone called Catherine Silva Hajo, and the poem is called Shell Shocked. It is always those with nothing more to lose, who time and again lose more. A truth on tender skin, hard branded, impossible to ignore that not a germ of mercy informs the calculus of those whose jaded eye is fixed upon opportunities interred beneath the slag. Blear-eyed stare, hunker down or cut and run, howl, reject blood, and promise it sleep in fragments, dissociate, scream, go silent, and fuck it, grab a broom, sweep the wreckage, shard by shred, by ash, by scrap. Then demand, is this how the world is to be rebuilt? So that was Catherine's poem, which was published in a Lebanese literary journal called Rusted Radishes. And I strongly advise that you all check it out. It was published a short while after the explosion at the Port of Beirut on the 4th of August. I couldn't find exact figures for how many people the explosion has killed, but it's around 200 people, and it's still taking lives. Catherine mentions those with nothing more to lose, who time and again lose more. And she's referring here to the multiple crises which were affecting Lebanon before the explosion. It was an economic crisis still going on, which has seen the Lebanese lira lose 80% of its value in 10 months. And a huge proportion of the population, the UN says half, are living in poverty. Corona is apparently in its second wave in Lebanon, but the country is struggling to lock down because there's a lack of support for people who are out of work. The urbanist Mona Fawaz said that the blast is more than a symptom of a failing system. It's an acceleration of the trends which were taking over Beirut. The city was being financialized, there was forced displacement of long-term residents, And there's been an erosion of public space and community services, which has been ongoing. And I understand that a couple of our panelists will be talking about that today. This weekend coming, we will be marking the anniversary of the revolution, or the Thawra, which has been ongoing since last October. But as Catherine suggests, there is still not a germ of mercy among those politicians who have fixed their eyes on opportunities to exploit Lebanon's resources. These were politicians who had been warlords during the Civil War and have held on to power since the end of the Civil War in 1990. They continue to hold on to power without government. Lebanon has had no government since the 10th of August, I think. They're still waiting, and according to the recently resigned Director General of the Ministry of Finance, their policy is to do nothing. Catherine ends her poem with a question. Is this how the world is to be rebuilt? And that is the question we're here to discuss today. And I see this question as breaking down into three themes. How is Beirut going to be rebuilt? How do people find the hope to rebuild? Where do they look? How do they deal with the trauma of the past? And where do they find hope from the potential of the revolution, hope for participation, pushing against sectarianism, and for political and social transformation? And finally, how is the world to be rebuilt? How does Beirut stand in for the world? What lessons can we learn from this place, a place which I found incredible and which has taught me so much? So we have posed a few questions to the panelists, which come from ourselves and our friends in Beirut. We've invited them to answer those questions if they choose to, or to speak about their own theme and interest for 7 minutes, and then we can pose questions at the end. So I'm going to invite Sari to speak first, and I'll give him 7 minutes. I'll try not to be too strict. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you so much for the invitation, and I'm glad to be with you. So in nutshells, I think Beirut is specifically very interesting because for me, as coming from the Arab world, epitomize what is mythological access to happiness. And this is a major problem created Anthropocene, this human destruction of the nature. I mean, the Lebanese middle class historically consuming much more than what they earn, etc. So the basic reflection I have is really, look, Beirut, maybe it show why COVID-19 is attacking us so globally nowadays. In the same, what I will argue today that in fact the Beirut explosion show that something positive, something that if you like, a solidarity, convivialism in the city that struck me so much. And what I will argue today that in fact today we are in the anniversary of 1 year of Lebanese uprisings. We can say amazing things about this uprising, but also we can say that it failed to reach its objectives because of this leaderless of a kind of disease. We find it a lot in the leftist movement. Let me be clear today and remind you Gilles Deleuze arguing that the left, the French philosopher, perceive the world in terms of so the left perceive the world in terms of relationship that begin from the most distant and move inward. So social inequality, for instance, understood as a large global phenomenon of exploitation whose relationship can be traces toward imperialism and colonialism. And then it's rarely where they work the local, the community levels. So and social class relation. When they come to that, to understand the local dynamics, they are already exhausted. The contrary of the left, you have identity politics movement, including religious movement, where we saw that they are so interested in community-based work, and they scale up. So into the more so from closer to distant. So this is what I try to say, that in fact maybe the Beirut blast, it was a moment to rethink for the Lebanese social movement, that we need really to work in a community basis, and not to leave it to identity politics movement, whether religious or not. And this is what we saw. People go and clean the street with the victims, and so I think we have a long way to go in the future until that the social movement, Lebanese social movement, think this focus going back to community instead of just from global to local, but to work also from local to global. And maybe the city now as embody all the problem of Lebanon, the failure of the governance, the corruption, the negligence, it's the environmental crisis. Maybe this is a moment to think an alternative politics, and something like I mean, yeah, an utopia, but I mean a real utopia that it's can work, and with this utopia, we should be more convivial, thinking more in Marcel Mauss' anthropological notion of a human being that give to a community, give to the city, and of course, and this is Marcel Mauss told us that giving has a counterpart is receiving, but also returning the gift. So I think in this dynamics, maybe the city is a site of thinking a human being not as a homo economicus, but as also a man of gift, of donation in a Marcel Mauss meaning. So this is, if you like, I hope this blast be a special moment to rethink this this politics, if you like, from distant to closer, but specifically from closer to more distant. Maybe it's 7 minutes. I stop here.
Sorry, that was perfectly 7 minutes. Thank you so much. I think that you said some things that I'm sure some of the panelists will want to come back and talk to you about. This idea of coming back to community and thinking of an alternative politics based on the person being a giver of gifts, and not having this mythological access to happiness you talked about. So I'm sure that they'll want to refer to that in the Q&A, but for now, we're going to go straight to Abir. Abir, are you able to speak and share your slides? Amazing. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. So since the explosion, hundreds of buildings in the neighboring districts have been evacuated. Residents left their houses because of the damage, but also because of the sense of shock they felt. Their departure poses a real risk to the feasibility of return to a livable city and sustainable neighborhoods. And there's a real palpable risk that their displacement, their fast displacement, would turn into a permanent state of eviction. Of course, fears of permanent displacement are exacerbated by a systematic weakening of the right to housing in the country and by catastrophic experiences of reconstruction in the past. Beirut and its suburbs had been destroyed and reconstructed a number of times, and reconstruction was always based on the very factors that had led to the destruction, such as class division or social segregation or real estate interests. In fact, the damaged neighborhoods house today a majority of high-risk tenants. And this is specifically particular because the neighborhood had been subjected to fierce land spoliation for a number of years now. If we take the case of Mar Mkhail, and this is a map of transfer of land ownership during the past 10 years, we can see that over the past decades, around 150 designer stores, art galleries, bars, and restaurants had mushroomed in the neighborhood, resulting in massive rising of land and property prices. This had a direct impact on housing affordability, resulting in many evictions of residents and old businesses. Now, this housing precarity was exacerbated after the blast. So if we understand, through our understanding of the neighborhood, there are three types of tenancy in the neighborhood. For many tenants renting under the so-called old rent law, which are all rent-controlled contracts before 1992, them, landlords see it as a chance to get rid of them and put back their houses in the speculative market. And we've seen this happening ever since the blast at a higher rate than before. Also, for so-called new tenants, which is the only rental law that currently governs rent contracts, which is only a 3-year contract. A lot of these people living under a 3-year rent contract have left their houses because they feel they do not want to go through the effort of renovating and then having to leave their house in a year or two after the price has risen due to renovation. And a third category is a lot of farmers and migrant workers who live under rent, but without any contracts, without any written contracts. These are being subjected to extreme eviction threats, where either the landlord is refusing to renovate and hence they're consequently leaving, or telling them you're no more welcome in the house and nothing can prove their right to the house. In fact, city dwellers in Lebanon have been in constant anxiety over the stability of their housing. No one records the slow violence that they're subjected to, and households across all factions of society are left alone to face such housing rights violations. In response, Public Works had launched the Housing Monitor a few years back. As you can see in the slide, the Housing Monitor monitors housing vulnerability on these several categories, either through the inability to pay rent or inability to pay house loan installments, or the inability to pay in dollars that's imposed by the landlord through the current crisis, and so on. So through these categories, we had been monitoring types and patterns of housing violations in periodical reports and other communication in order to build an informed public opinion and advocate for the right to housing. More recently, after the blast, we launched a reporting form as well as a hotline. We called on all city dwellers, and particularly those subject to housing insecurity, to not let their housing threats to continue unreported. We call for residents to report. We've also distributed a large number of flyers and posters in the neighborhoods to have people report. And the monitor also follows on these urgent cases and connects them with pertinent support on legal and other social matters. Today, and more than 2 months now after the explosion, the state has still not put in place a policy to rehabilitate the damaged neighborhoods nor has it clarified the process of compensation. Instead, it has issued a reconstruction law that focuses on buildings and heritage, failing to state any motivation to protect the social fabric, communities, and livelihoods that have been heavily affected. The law also accentuates the sanctity of private property with no mention of other constitutional values, such as housing and social justice. And while the law puts some restrictions on land pooling and transfer of land ownership, also with a clear sectarian discourse, such physical planning tools, we believe, will remain ineffective in the absence of a socioeconomic approach. In fact, the state's deliberate absence paved the way for multiple redundant surveys, unreliable relief operations, in addition to ambiguities in the fate of compensation funds. As a result, the provision of aid has also become a form of humiliation to people in need. The residents have also witnessed the self-interested involvement of sectarian parties and religious bodies in the renovation efforts, contributing in the long run to reimposing their control over urban space and feeding into clientelistic relations at the expense of collective rights. We are not merely victims, nor are we recipients of aid. We are active agents with rights. This is what one woman shouted out in a community focus group that we held. These community meetings are part of a wider effort that we're doing with the aim of building a representational framework for all those affected by the blast. The effort departs first by recognizing that residents have been made absent from discussions around reconstruction priorities, and they have also been dealt with individually, not collectively. Our effort begins with the aim of reinstating people's voices, their collective concerns, and their role in determining their common priorities. We believe that any opportunity for collective action and claim formation in the absence of existing organizational structures or neighborhood committees will be directly linked to the success of forming this representative framework with local community. So if the aim or if the main objective is to reclaim socioeconomic life and to enable a dignified return of residents to their homes, and if our main is to guarantee a rehabilitation process that is truly people-centered, the role and voice of the people must be reclaimed, and for forming these neighborhood committees and the representational framework that represents all those affected by the blast is actually the first stepping stone towards that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Abir. Abir has really brought home, I think, for us how challenging it's going to be to secure the return of residents to the city and to kind of start these community conversations that Sari brought up in his presentation. I want to turn now to Mia. Mia is the co-founder and president of Embrace, which is a really important mental health charity and service that's running in Lebanon at the moment. And I'm really interested to hear what she has to say about how mental health has got a really important part to play in rebuilding. Thank you, Mia.
Thank you, Hannah. It was interesting to see Abir showing us some pictures again from the city and from the community, because I think that whenever we see pictures of Beirut, all of us are triggered somehow with all the different emotions we have been experiencing for the last 2 months, but also for the last almost 1 year in a few days with as Sari mentioned, the anniversary of the revolution. And what's interesting as well is that Abir showed us some pictures of the city, and sometimes when we see things visually, we can understand, the extent of the damage. But when we talk about mental health, it's something that we've been saying for a very long time. It's not something that we can see. We don't see the suffering as often as we, at least in the last 2 months, I think it's a little bit different, and the concept of mental health and how we see things has changed drastically in the last few months in Lebanon. But for a very long time, mental health and mental illness and well-being wasn't something we could actually, visualize or touch. it was something really we had to ask about, and we had to really ask those questions to people to really understand what they're going through and what they're feeling. And much of us in our community, we talk a lot, we express a lot, but we're not really listening to people suffering, and we're not talking about mental health as much as we need to. In the last 2 to 3 months, these things have changed significantly. As you mentioned, the blast came after a few months of Lebanon also struggling, and the world with COVID-19, where during the period of the pandemic, which is still ongoing and increasing today, with Lebanon experiencing the increased numbers, COVID allowed us to talk more about mental health, about the importance of supporting each other during global crises such as Corona, about the importance of providing social support amidst social distancing and people not being able to connect with each other at the human level. Today, when we see each other, we miss embracing each other, we miss being able to share that connection with one another, with our families, who sometimes we are having to be away from during COVID, especially our elderly parents. So everything that has happened in the last few months has really triggered all our emotions and triggered this conversation around mental health in Lebanon, not to mention the dire effects and consequences of the economic and the social crisis. I mean, for me personally, and for everybody that I see on the streets, there's been a talk about mental health since last October 17, where actually mental health changed with the revolution of the people. People were becoming more open, were feeling that they have the right to talk more, to speak more about what they need. Personally, as a psychologist, I witnessed so many people who used to suffer from different mental health problems, and being able to revolt against injustice and against the community that were living them, and allowed them an opportunity to actually heal from some social anxieties. The opening of public spaces in the city allowed them to connect with one another, which is something that we have been really, that has been taken away from us for the last maybe 30 years since the Civil War. And then the pandemic, the crisis happened, and the Beirut explosion. What we saw in the early weeks of the explosion is people really coming together, and this helped enormously in the healing process. However, we know that the impact of trauma rarely starts in the first few weeks after a traumatic event, and it's actually today, 2 months after, that we are beginning to see some of the long-term and more complicated impact of the trauma. Today we are seeing people more often in our clinics and complaining of different stress symptoms, not being able to sleep continuously until today, experiencing flashbacks, experiencing rethinking of the event, re-seeing it, reimagining it, and also having difficulty, going to the same places that are close to the explosion, and even difficulty going back to their homes. And this we didn't see in the first few weeks, because people were still shell-shocked, people were still trying to gather themselves to go to clean the streets, to clean the houses, and today the impact is showing more and more. We have a great responsibility today amidst the economic crisis. People also are having difficulty accessing mental health services. Today, a service that already was a luxury in Lebanon now is triple its price, with people also suffering not just from the Beirut explosion, but also from the hardships of being able to go on with the daily living every day. At Embrace, we've been working very hard for the past 7 years, not just to break the stigma and to allow people to talk more openly about mental health, which I think we have done, along with our different partners locally, a good job at breaking the stigma around mental health, encouraging people to talk more about it. Our difficulty today is how we will be able to provide access to services that are affordable to the community. And our bigger difficulty after the Beirut explosion as well is there is no healing as well from the impact of this trauma without social justice, and without people being able to access their basic rights, And this is going to be one of the bigger challenges we will be able to will have to face as a community, that will require collective action and will require really to reignite as well the revolution of October 17, 2019.
Thank you so much, Mia. I really liked what you said at the end. There is no healing without social justice. I completely agree with you. And finally, I want to turn now to Nasser, who will be talking about the explosion and hopefully leading us in a slightly more positive direction, thinking about the collective again. Thank you, Nasser.
Thank you, Hannah. Thanks for the invitation. It's great to be back at DPU, albeit virtually over the screen. So I'm going to give an overview perhaps of the a picture from above rather than whatever Mia and Abir have mentioned around the dynamics within the community, whether through the rebuilding or through the healing process. And of course, I'd contribute and add to what Sari did in the beginning. I think the explosion of the Beirut port, regardless of what triggered it as an explosion, as whatever happened, but I see it, unfortunately, as a natural result of decades of failed policies, or maybe better put it, failed paradigm that existed in Lebanon after 1990 or 1991 with the end of civil war. I see it really as the final straw on the paradigm of post-Civil War reconstruction in Lebanon that started 29 or 30 years ago. And I'm going to elaborate and say why actually this failed. So the post-Civil War reconstruction and recovery process in Lebanon that started in the early 90s was built on three foundations. The first one was to bribe warlords, those who were fighting for more than 15 years in Lebanon prior to 1990. It was, so this foundation was to bribe them to be in government and to become peace lords, and to give them positions as MPs, as ministers, as leaders, as undersecretaries, ambassadors, name it. So that was the premise, and that was the way it happened. So many people who were active at that time would say they just woke up in early 1991 and saying the war was over. So there was no discussion about reconciliation or about healing, as Mia mentioned. We just moved on, and those who were fighting started to be put in office over the next few years in the 90s. And that allowed them, bribing them to be in power, but allowed them to capture the state and capture the economy and look into it and take it and treat it as a trophy. So that actually what has been practiced or put in practice for the last 30 years in Lebanon. That's the first point. And the second point in this post-Civil War reconstruction premise paradigm was to rely on foreign aid that would flow into the country. In the early 90s, the idea was we get money from the rich Gulf countries, and later on to get aid from European and the more developed nations, particularly on the assumption that we need to keep Lebanon stable because Lebanon is part of European neighborhood and so on. And the third foundation of the post-Civil War reconstruction was to get a guardian for this process, and that was between 1990, 1991, and 2005, was the Syrian government or the Syrian army or the Syrian regime, who practiced some kind of being the sponsor of the post-war arrangement between the different factions that went into this quote-unquote peace process in Lebanon. But of course, these three foundations, they started to fall, and they started to fall apart. Not in August 2020, not last few months. Actually, they started to crumble many years ago, and that was part of why Lebanese are taking it to the streets, not since last year, but actually since 2012 and 15 and later on. So it crumbled and it fell apart because for the same reasons they were built on. They were built on very shaky foundations. The first one was, that of course warlords kept treating the state and the economy as a trophy, as I mentioned, as treating it and getting from the spoils of the post-war as much as possible, enriching themselves, enriching their cronies, their relatives. And rather than looking into their position in office as a public office to treat the public and work towards the public good, they were working towards their private goods and towards their cronies, followers, and so on. The second point was that money has stopped actually early on in Lebanon. It kept coming in, aid money kept coming, but in very much smaller amounts. So the state had to rely on the central bank, and the central bank had to go in a Ponzi-like scheme with the private banks and bankers who were getting a lot of the profits from this arrangement. So such arrangement, very Ponzi-like scheme, now very well known, kept funding the state in such unsustainable way. And the third foundation from the Syria regime that acted as a sponsor, it started to crumble because the Syria regime wanted to also, get into the spoils of the post-war, and they became quite bloody in that, and it led to them being violent and assassinating leaders, politicians, and being quite violent in this, and it ended with the withdrawal. So what we see since 2005 was something different in Lebanon, that we never managed to get into a new model that we all dream of. So the explosion of the port is basically the end of this era. This is the end of this paradigm, that we need to think of it as a new beginning. I'm not here optimistic, but what I'm saying, it was a natural result of all of these failed policies and paradigm that started in 1990. So where do we go from here? Whatever is happening now is not very promising, but at least many new actors and many new groups in Lebanon are keen on using and looking into the reconstruction process in Lebanon and the reconstruction of Beirut and the Beirut port as the entry for something big for the country. What do I mean? I mean, we want to look into rebuilding Beirut and its port in a way that actually that we can put the foundations for a new paradigm or a new model for developing and reconstructing and rehabilitating the city and the country. And here it has to be more inclusive with communities. It has to be, of course, more participatory, but also more transparent, looking into the goods and the public goods rather than the private interests of politicians, businessmen, bankers, developers, and so on, but also to make it more effective and efficient and an entry into reconstructing and recovering the state from those corrupt leaders that we had for the last many years. So, I mean, that's the premise here. That's all what we hope we can do. Are we going to make it? I think it's not going to be easy. So the beginning of all of this is to happen through political change at the level of having real change in the next parliamentary elections or next municipal elections, because the current tools of protest that many new political groups that have been using since October 2019 are becoming ineffective. So we need to think of new tools and new ways to get those ideas we have, the paradigm we're hoping to put in the country for reconstructing Beirut and redeveloping the nation in a way through maybe municipal election, parliamentary elections, where those opposition groups that emerged since last year can come together, or at least small groups of them can come together and maybe get into real politics by enacting change, by being in office. I'm going to stop here, and maybe we can elaborate on some points in the Q&A. Thank you. Thank you, Anna.
Thank you, Nasser. Before I ask Chaim to come back, and I think he's going to chair the Q&A, I just want to say a massive thank you to our panelists who made the time to come here today. And I mean, we can all learn a lot from what has happened in Beirut. And I think it's fascinating what Nasser said, that maybe the reconstruction of Beirut can be the entry point for the foundations that we want to build for a more positive, a more just Lebanon and world. As Catherine reminds us, Beirut can stand in for the world. And I think also what's really interesting about what everyone's spoken about today is that there's something important about the revolution. I'm not sure if it's failed. I think it's hanging in the background, and it's a reminder that there is another possible future, that people have had enough, and they're ready to take collective action, and that's where this healing will come in. So Haim, would you mind taking over and doing the Q&A? I can't choose between questions.
That's fine.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, all panelists, and thank you very much, Hannah. I think it was a fascinating discussion, and unfortunately, I will not be able to present all the questions, so I will try with the first general question to all panelists, try to answer as short as you can, and then maybe we'll have more time for more specific questions. So Tess Tuck asked for all speakers, how do you envision rebuilding and healing efforts in a time of mass immigration and the brain drain in Lebanon? So maybe we'll start with Mia. Would you like to answer on it? And you can answer online if you want, but to other questions. Mia?
Han, can you just repeat the question, because I think it got interrupted a little bit.
Okay, the question is, how can we envision rebuilding and healing efforts in a time of mass immigration and the brain drain?
I think what we're doing currently right now, at least as part of Embrace, is we are trying to use also some of the resources available to us from the Lebanese diaspora, who have actually jumped at the opportunity to be able to be helpful in any way after the Beirut explosion. So they are playing a big role as well from where they are, at least in terms of mental health. Many mental health professionals have been providing services and offering to help and support the community from abroad. And this has been helping us a lot at Embrace, especially with the brain drain that we have been experiencing actually. So recently we have launched a free mental health clinic to provide services. And we have really suffered in terms of being able to recruit mental health professionals to be joining us. I think we have to bring back the hope in many different ways, one of which Nasser alluded to, in how we rebuild the whole structure and how we get people to really think of coming back. Many have left with a lot of pain leaving, and many of them have left saying that, you know, it's just temporary, maybe I'll be back in a few months. So I think there's a lot of hope still left for the people who are still here to be able to get people back very soon on board.
Thank you, Mia. Sari, would you like to add something?
Well, I think I am very pessimistic about the local dynamics in Lebanon nowadays, and I think reconstruction is a moment of elite formation, and historically we have many cases where you have a new elite with closer to the donors sometimes. And wanted they project donors' agenda, but sometimes it's the contrary. I mean, it enables new elite formation, and here the moment for Lebanon, I think French initiative came because it was a total blockage in local level. So I do believe less and less I believe on sovereignty of states. I think there is countries, they should admit that there is no local solution, and Lebanon, Syria, for instance, Yemen, without international intervention cannot be possible. So I hope it will be a moment or reconstruction of empowering a new elite, and this is the issue at stakes, and still until today the story is not clear about whether it will be a government, whether it will be independent, and things like that.
Thank you, Sari. And Nasser, would you like to add something?
I mean, some of the questions also might be interesting to answer. You know, I think, you know, I don't. While I agree with Sari, but the size and the scale of what happened in Beirut in 3 seconds is unprecedented at all levels. It's something. I'm old enough to know the civil war in Lebanon and the post-civil war. 15 years of destruction of the central Beirut happened in the neighborhoods around the port in a few seconds. So I think this has led to a lot of anger among the Lebanese. And I don't think it will be an easy take for elites and some of the corrupt politicians to regenerate themselves through the reconstruction process. I think civil society has become more conscious and aware about these. The community itself, grassroots groups and so on have been emerging to look into the reconstruction process, to monitor it, to observe it, to be part of it. Of course, there are and there will be corrupt practices here and there, but I think it's totally different this time. And I'm hoping that in the coming year or two, the opposition groups, the emerging opposition groups from the revolution or from the uprising would also take part in having or in acting more accountability in such processes. The international community is more aware of this and they're conscious about this. And we're also monitoring them as well as monitoring the government. So I think it is, in a way, a turning point. The scale of it makes it a turning point in the everyday politics in Beirut. Now, of course, some people would resort to all of this by leaving, by just, you know, taking the plane and leaving. And that happens in all over contexts and societies. But also a lot of us are going to stay and they're going to keep, you know, I think fighting for this.
Thanks, Nasser. Thank you very much. Abir? Is Abir with us?
Yes, I'm with you. Sorry, I was replying to some of the answers in the Q&A. Maybe I would jump, because a lot of has been said on this question. I could jump to some of the questions that have been addressed in relation to housing and to...
Yes, please, but leave some space to the others, okay?
Yes, I will. So there's a question related to housing models. I mean, how to think about housing models in the affected area. I think the particularity of this area is that it has a very high percentage of already abandoned or empty apartments that have been left for years and do not house anybody. So one of the housing models could be is that incentives are given to this empty vacant stock to be given a priority in renovation, in return that the landlord would put it for rental at an affordable fair rent. So this could be one of the models that's very much specific to the area and also specific to a lot of neighborhoods in Beirut. There's also an interesting question about how do we take into consideration when we're building a community representational structure, how do we take into consideration some of the most marginalized communities? So one of the questions mentions the LGBTQ community. I would add also the migrant community and others. So one of the main things we are doing in this respect is that we are actually working towards formally establishing and registering this representative framework. And to reach to it, we're doing focus groups or small meetings with all sorts of social groups. So with migrants, with residents of certain neighborhoods, with the sectors, and so on. And a very important part of the bylaws of this framework is going to be ethics related to the tolerance of all communities affected by the blast, regardless of their orientation, regardless of their nationality, and regardless of their affiliation. Is there a question you would like to take to the round time?
Yeah, I think, maybe I will use the more, I would say, thematical questions. And I would like to pose 3 questions now to Mia, Sari, and Nasser. To Sari, we forget often that political and social change is a process, and it doesn't happen quickly despite urgency of situation. So I would like to have your reflection on it in a minute. And for Nasser, it's a very provocative question, I suppose. I would like to know if you think this tragic event is a turning point for Beirut. Realistically, what do you think is coming next? And to Mia, there was a question with a compliment to embrace. How can we tie together social justice and healing? I think, in relation to what you are doing, which has to do with mental well-being. So maybe we'll start with Sari, Nasser, Mia, and hopefully we'll have time for a last question to Abir.
Well, something I would like to say that in the failed state, like the case in Lebanon, the non-governmental organizations and civil society should take a form of a community-based organizations if really they want a social change to be generated. So if you like, we can think about the state, the institution, enabling racism, enabling bad politics, gentrification, etc., etc. But what is very interesting for me that Lebanon is a case where society are not much sustainable politically because of what the criticism of Gilles Deleuze of the left. You need to rethink who are the new actors who work in a very local levels to undermine to generate resilience in this really very moment of the crisis. Roham Quwatli asked me about the refugee camps in surrounding Beirut. They are in a very terrible shape nowadays after a few years of more crowdedness coming because of the Palestinian of Syria or the Syrian refugees. So and I witnessed their resilience thanks to this community-based work. I mean, it's more convivial place than other places where the absence of conviviality is make people really generating violence, insecurity, and so on. So I think again I insist that we need to rethink what kind of political actions and social action should be taken in order to mitigate the catastrophe we are witnessing in Lebanon, COVID-19, economic crisis, collapse, and of course the blast effects.
Thank you, Sari. Nasser?
Well, I think it is a turning point. I think it is a turning point. Just a few days after the explosion, people went to the streets demonstrating, and they were faced by, I think, the most violent reaction from the police, from security. So the anger that has actually that almost everyone in Lebanon felt, and around Lebanon as well felt, and who know Lebanon felt with this explosion, I think is going to be translated somewhere. It's now for the Lebanese and for Lebanese civil society and for the activists and the new political groups to utilize this turning point into political action. I don't see other way. I don't see neither the French, nor Monsieur Macron, nor the British Prime Minister, nor Trump, nor anyone else would actually do anything. It's just for the Lebanese in order to convince the general public to vote for new leaders who can come into the municipality or parliament. I don't see other way, and neither a violent way to get into the state institutions and run them. So I'm optimistic that the coming election in 2 years' time would carry in new leaders who would emerge, who have been active since maybe the last 5 years or so, but active mostly for the last few months, and who would be in the parliament or municipality or any other institution. Now, it could go another way. It could go actually with Lebanese feeling that they cannot take it anymore and they want to leave. And they want to leave and live in Canada and enjoy the snow and deers and lovely wild animals of Canada. That's a choice. But I'm also a firm believer that many Lebanese are going to stay, and I think some of them are going to come back and join those activists in the coming democratic fight. I'm talking more politics than academic here, but I think the nature of the question pushed me to say so.
Yeah, Mia, can you answer very shortly, because I think we need to finish the event?
Yes, I will answer shortly, even though it's a question that takes some time to elaborate on, but thank you, Claire, for that question. Indeed, as you mentioned, justice has been denied for a very long time in Lebanon, and this is partly why also the Beirut blast also reignited a lot of memories of the civil war for many people living in Beirut and the area. And this is because from 30 years till today, actually, we have not also been able to work through transitional justice. So for many people who witnessed the Beirut blast, also they recollected memories and events of the civil war. And this really brought over and exacerbated also reaction to the blast. How we can build a little bit towards that, we need to definitely work on educating and empowering the youth, who more recently are taking a much bigger role in social and political action. And through that, we are really counting on the generation that is really has led through this revolution in the past year to be able to fight for these rights. And we need to work more in the community and focus also less on maybe normalizing some of the reactions to the Beirut blast and saying that we will be resilient again, we will be able to overcome. Resilience is simply going back to our normal baseline, but it's not being able to fight against this oligarchy and the system that we are really trying to overcome. So we need to definitely provide mental health services for everybody who is in need, but also encourage individuals who come to therapy to be able to really reflect back on their values. What does it mean to them to heal, actually? And if being able to fight for their rights as part of their healings, we need to encourage that in clinical therapy. And this is where we can work from the society, but also in some of the clinical means that Claire was alluding to in her question.
Many thanks to all of you. If to judge according to the comments, you did a wonderful job today. So I really want to thank the panel participants, and to Hannah, and to Alex McFarn and Otavia Pasta, our colleagues from the DPU, who helped us to authorize this event. And finally, to our interpreters for their hard job, I suppose, to translate this conversation into Arabic. Thank you very much. We will publish, the recorded event, and you are very welcome to join our other dialogues in development. Thank you very much.